Welcome to the Classical Commons Podcast, a conversation exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, and we're connecting classical school communities to talent and resources nationwide. Today's guests are the co-authors of a recent release from Encounter Books entitled Slacking, a Guide to Ivy League Miseducation. The three authors have all been involved in higher ed at various levels: teachers, professors, policy analysts, scholars, and they're concerned about the decline of liberal education in the U.S., especially as it's effectively modeled or seen in the high end, that is to say, the 8 Ivy League institutions. These are the premier players of American higher ed. And according to the authors, these supposed exemplars have for some time shown increasing signs of erosion, both in the coherence of the curricula and the quality of academic life. So their book, Slacking, details that trajectory of decline and shows both highlights at where they are and some lowlights from each institution. Adam Kissel is a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's also a board member of the University of West Florida, Southern Wesleyan University, and the National Association of Scholars. Rachel Alexander Cambre teaches at Louisiana State University, Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady University, and Sequitur Classical Academy in Baton Rouge, as well as an online master's in classical at Belmont Abbey. And Madison Merino Doan is a visiting fellow with the Maryland Family Institute and a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. So without further ado, welcome Adam, Rachel, and Madison. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Glad to be here.
Well, your book is probably going to make quite a splash, I'm guessing. I was delighted to see that Encounter had picked it up and that they were willing to take on such a, kind of a hot button topic. It seems like you're really kind of poking the bear, or taking a shot at our top institutions, but with legitimate concerns. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the backstory of this book. How did you decide to take up this research on the Ivies? What prompted your investigation?
I'd say about a year and a half ago, I was thinking about the October 7th aftermath and how the protests against Israel and in favor of Hamas were unfolding on college campuses. And I was thinking there's got to be a curriculum angle to that. Why are people so badly formed that they're acting this way? So I took a look at the Cornell Gen Eds, the basic core curriculum that all arts and sciences students have to take, and started nosing around the courses. And things were so much worse than I expected that I wrote up what was going on in each of the different core areas. And then I said, you know what, this is so bad. Let's see what's happening in the rest of the Ivy League. And I brought in Rachel and Madison so that we could do all 8 of the Ivy League institutions. And again, I think at least I was surprised and appalled at how much worse things had gotten since I had last thought about curriculum issues at the core gen ed level.
And that's a good point, since you last thought about it. So, you've been involved, as I mentioned, as board member at institutions of higher education, but when was the last time you even thought that maybe there's some problems in higher ed's curricula?
Back in the 1990s, the National Association of Scholars did a couple of really well done reports. And the question now a generation ago was, do they still teach Western civilization at the best colleges in America? Do they still teach Shakespeare? Is it still required at the best colleges in America? And the answer was, it was decreasing, that you could still find those courses, but those kinds of requirements were going away. Yeah. A generation later, today, the question is, can you find even one Shakespeare course that's worth taking, or even on the books? Can you find any good Western Civ? So the question a generation ago was, are we losing our inheritance, our intellectual inheritance? The answer was yes. Today, it's, yep, we've lost it.
I have to say, ladies, you represent that younger generation. Adam and I, we're the old guys in the room, so let's just be clear about that. But what prompted you all to sign on for this project? Because he'd seen something and was interested and wanted to go after it. You, on the other hand, didn't have that same experience. How'd you get it? What was your initial response to Adam? What were you thinking?
Yeah, so Madison and I both, I think, are very
interested in liberal arts education. I went to a liberal arts college. My background is in the study of political philosophy, the history of Western political thought. And so I've always been very interested and concerned about the status of liberal education in the United States. When I started teaching at Baylor University as a graduate student, I encountered the first actually core course that I'd ever encountered at a university. So the university I went to had these distributional requirements where you had to take one course in the social sciences, one course in quantitative reasoning. It was very broad and vague, which as an undergraduate, I was surprised by myself. I wanted a little more guidance. But when I came to Baylor actually had, and I believe this is still the case, a constitutional development course that every student had to take regardless of your major. And I taught that course for a couple of years and found it to be such a lovely experience to have different disciplines come together and study something that every student at the university had to study and study something very significant, the development of our constitutional tradition, our constitutional history. And so I was interested when Adam proposed this idea in seeing, is this the case at Ivy League universities? Are there any core courses left? Is there a fixed general education being transmitted to these students?
Yeah, and Madison, how about you?
Yeah, similar to Rachel, although I would say a little bit of a different experience too, is that I went to a small public university in Texas where there really were no general education requirements. And so after moving to DC from Texas, that was really something that I was really wanting. And so got involved with some like conservative fellowships that taught a lot about first principles and things that I think a lot of students probably would want to learn in terms of their general education requirements. And then as reading and learning from different scholars like Adam and others from NAS and various others, realized that there was a lot of reform that needs to happen in higher education reform. And then at that same time, my husband was recently accepted into Harvard Business School. And so we were thinking about a potential move to Boston. And I was like, oh man, we're about to go into the belly of the beast. I better be prepared into what we might encounter. So yeah, so when Adam approached us with this project, I thought it was a great idea. An area that really needed a closer look into.
Yeah, it does. And I'm really glad that you all signed on for this because it's probably not all of that. It's not the kind of thing you're going to be rewarded for in certain circles. And I'm guessing you probably have your detractors. But let's talk a bit about what you did and how you approached this methodologically, how you gathered and interpreted your findings. Because I'm interested in whether this is the kind of thing that requires inside baseball, you got to really know where to go and look, or if it's the kind of thing anyone, with internet access could basically find online from these institutions. How did you go about getting your data?
Yeah, this information actually is broadly available, at least the course titles of the courses that can be taken to fulfill various distributional requirements. So most universities have an online course catalog. And what we did is we looked at the university's general education requirements list. So for example, what subject areas they require students to take courses in. And then we were able to filter through course catalogs to see what courses qualify to fulfill those requirements. And in most cases, hundreds of courses qualify. So it does take some time to come through, but the courses have titles and then course descriptions. Unfortunately, syllabi are not publicly available, but we were able to get enough information about the tenor of the course and what it would cover from the course titles and the content. And that is something available to anyone with internet access.
Yeah.
I would just add that another flavor that we weren't able to capture is looking at what each professor takes as their spin on the course. So taking Columbia University as our example, the core courses there are generally Western Civ oriented and great, but they're taught very often by graduate students who hate the tradition that they're teaching. And that is a harder thing to get into when we're thinking about what's the actual quality of the course. At least the students are being exposed to the material. I would rather have them reading Beowulf than watch Beyonce videos. But the way the course is taught is similar to also not knowing what this is actually in the reading list, except when those particular readings are already in the course description.
Of the 8 Ivies, can I ask? You make an interesting case, both anecdotally from your experience, Rachel, of teaching a course that all undergraduates at Baylor experienced in common. There's something about that. It creates, I imagine, some esprit de corps. Did you find anything comparable in any of the Ivies where a common course or a common experience would have been available to all and expected, right? Required of all?
The only one of the Ivies that has something like that, offers something like that, is, as Adam mentioned, Columbia University. So Columbia does still require core courses for students to take, a few of them in the history of Western Civ, Western thought. And so that is something that, if you're a Columbia graduate and you meet a fellow Columbia graduate or student on campus, there's some common ground there. And so material for forming that kind of fellowship in education, a fellowship of educated individuals. The other universities all embrace the distributional model, which is the model in which a university lists some broad areas or proficiencies that students can just choose a course to take in.
Now at Cornell, and at some of the other institutions, you can see how many students registered for each course.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So in the sciences,
what are at the top of the list, Adam? What are people really clamoring for?
Well, they want to be slackers, so they want to take the easy courses. So, so you can see that the best subscribed science course to meet one of your science requirements is a course called the Solar System. Now that can be made rigorous and challenging, but if there's 25 sections worth of Cornell students taking it, I think they all know that it's the easy version of the Solar System.
Yeah. Just want to establish for the record that it's a heliocentric system that we're working with. I'm joking, of course, but you often wonder, right? If there's not a requirement, then maybe, our human nature sets in. I'm very interested, though, in how history may have played a role, because as you said, Adam, this is not new ground. And back in the 90s, when NAS and others were trying to look at what was going on in the curriculum, there weren't very hopeful signs. That was sort of the beginning of this decline, or maybe it was already underway. But how does the history of Gen Ed factor into your work? Were you considering that in some respects, or are you just taking this snapshot illustrative of where we are today?
Well, the challenge really begins with someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson and the switch from the classical education model to what you might call the romantic educational model. So in the classical education model, there's specific things that every educated human being and citizen should know and be able to understand. And in the classical, the pre-romantic era, that was lots of Greek and Latin, especially the Latin. It was reading, math, and the language arts, especially. And someone like Emerson comes in and says, you know what? People aren't using Latin in real life. We need to just open up the curriculum, hitch your wagon to a star, study whatever you want. So the romantic vision is what brought us to this distribution requirement, where it's just an idea: learn some math, learn some science, learn some language arts, take anything you want. Any history is as good as any other history. Pursue your passion. So I would blame the romantic era and someone like Emerson for getting us away from a classical education model.
Adam, that's not a very encouraging word. That's 200 years that this thing has been going downhill. That's a long slide.
Rob, if I could add a little bit of context, Scott Yenner recently, in an article I think he wrote with the James G. Martin Center, he talked about kind of the decline of the college curriculum, specifically in the U.S. And he mentioned that basically in the 1800s, that most of the college curriculum was prescribed. But then Harvard President Charles Eliot first made the switch to an elective curriculum in the late 1800s. And he said that students could make their way through Harvard guided only by their choices. And then soon after, Yale followed in 1901, Cornell in 1905, and then Harvard completely abandoned its elective system for the major general education approach that we see now in 1910. So you just see hundreds of years of this kind of decline of the gen ed happening in the US.
We appreciate that, Madison, because again, a long time coming. Adam, you were going to say?
Yeah, so a couple of responses to that. So right around that same time, Columbia said, you know what, we actually want to have a core curriculum after all. These other institutions are not doing it. We're going to do it. So Columbia's curriculum is now 100 years old or more. Meanwhile, by the 1920s and 30s, there were folks who said, you know what, we did make a mistake. So the general education movement came back into vogue a little bit. And you ended up with a place like University of Chicago going back to a classical education model. Yeah. So there are some higher points in the history. It's not all doom and gloom for the last 200 years.
Moreover, we'd like to think that the Columbias and the U Chicagos stepping forward and adopting more of the classical model might actually be inspiration for today's universities. Again, we'd like to think so, or be hopeful. Now, as you undertook this investigation, I'd like us to get a little bit more into the weeds around how you discovered or explored the subjects. What did you focus on? Again, we've been talking about Gen Ed. Let's just dig in. What constituted Gen Ed as you were looking at it across the Ivies?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just sort of add, piggybacking on what Adam and Madison said, that I find when we talk about this book, a lot of people don't know what general education means because so many universities have abandoned it. And so I like to explain it as stemming from a very basic, but now I think contested idea, which is that there are certain things that every educated person should know, and that it's a university's job to first define those things and then teach them. And that's just become increasingly rare. Nowadays, a lot of universities leave it up to students and faculty members who have very niche interests to decide what is offered and what students want to take. So what we focused on is so just to give that as the background context of what a general education should be doing. As we've mentioned a few times now, most universities, and this includes all but one Ivy, all but Columbia, now embrace this distributional model where instead of telling students what they need to know to become an educated person, they tell students, well, you really should have a smattering of courses in these broad subject areas. Humanities and arts might be one, social sciences, quantitative reasoning, foreign language, writing course. And so as long as you take a course in each of these requirements, and there will be hundreds offered. So Yale in 2024 offered 751 courses that could be taken to fulfill the humanities and arts requirement. So these are very, very broad requirements. So what we did is we focused on in each chapter on the subject areas that university requires. And so it varies a little bit from university to university. So Dartmouth has more subject area requirements that are more specific than Yale, for example. Dartmouth has an arts requirement in which students have to take an art, and then they have a separate literature requirement, and then they have a philosophy requirement. So there's some variety. Brown does not require students to take any general education requirements except for a writing course. So for each chapter, the areas we focus on is a bit different, but it's dictated by what that university requires.
You know, as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, Rachel, maybe this project down at Austin is the kind of thing we need to do across the country and get some institutions excited about offering forbidden courses, because as I think you all know, the offerings over at the University of Austin are forbidden only because they're the tradition, and they're coming at the tradition with the kind of contested questions that really have driven humanity deeper into its self-understanding, right? The exploration of the great conversation, as it's sometimes called. So I wonder if there's just, maybe a little rhetorical positioning that we're going to have to offer here if we're going to make the good stuff and the difficult stuff, no doubt, a little more appealing. But that being said, I'm really fascinated by what you found in the respective institutions. So maybe you could share a few highlights and, of course, the lowlights that everyone is probably interested in from these 8 Ivy Leagues.
Yeah, so looking at these courses, so we went through each university and looked at what courses they offer that can be taken from them. I would say we found most of the courses that deviate from what a general education should be offering deviate in one of 3 ways. So we found one group of courses that are exceedingly narrow and niche. So Princeton has a course on shoes, the history of shoes, that students can take. Yale has a course on the history of paper. There are these very specific and narrow courses that could potentially be academically rigorous, but they don't offer a general education to students.
Mhm.
They're not giving them foundational knowledge in a given discipline. The second way in which a lot of these courses deviate is that a lot of them are blatantly ideological. They pretty openly advance an ideological agenda. So the most common of which is they advance some version of critical theory in which, you know, they suggest and do not examine this idea as an idea up for debate, but simply take for granted that the world is divided between oppressors and oppressed, and apply this lens to different disciplines. So Yale has a course called Managing Blackness in White Space. Cornell has a course called Intersectional Disability Studies. These are pretty common, these kinds of courses. And then the third common form of slacker course we found are a lot of these courses are focused on some very obviously non-academic topic. So there are a lot of pop culture courses where the course material are music videos, reality television, pop music. So there's I think it's a Cornell course that's called Who Run the World, Girls, and it's on Madonna, Missy Elliott, Cardi B, Britney Spears. And so there's no real reading going on. You know, there's some supposed study of the lyrics of these, this music. So we found a lot of courses like that are just on pop music, pop culture. And usually these courses too overlap with the ideological courses, but a lot of these are the primary deviations that we found across all 8 Ivies.
That's really helpful. Madison, were there any other patterns or leitmotifs perhaps that you noticed as you undertook this research?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So something that I noticed through the 3 universities that I looked at, which was Harvard, Princeton, and UPenn, was that there was a lack of requirements related to learning about American history or Western civilization. So for example, Penn has this like history and tradition general education requirement, but when I dug deeper into the courses that were offered, there was hardly any choices for students who wanted to learn about American history. And then there was actually this class called Deciphering America, which focuses on maybe a few telling moments in history, but definitely did not give like a wide span of terms of the breadth of like US history. And then at Harvard, there was a requirement called History, Societies, Individuals. And many of the available courses are hostile to American civilization, narrow or unlikely to represent diverse viewpoints. And actually there was a class taught in 2023 called Race in a Polarized America, which said that basically was asking like if the US at its core was a white supremacist society. And then at Princeton, there was another course requirement called historical analysis. There were over 100 different courses that could fulfill this requirement. And, students did have the opportunity to choose from like introduction to the classics of the Roman Republic, but another class that can fulfill that requirement is like understanding the recent queer past or magic and witchcraft in the ancient world. So surprising amount of courses and no actual requirements related to like American history or Western civilization within those 3 colleges.
Well, back to your comment, Adam, perhaps this explains, or at least has some value as an explanatory cause for why a generation is in many ways turning their backs on their own nation. If this is what they're being fed pretty consistently, it should not surprise us, right? That they're looking down the nose at a nation that they consider to be morally suspect at best and probably culpable in the worst case. I think that's important, but I'm hoping that in the course of your research, there were a few good surprises. Anything out there that we should be able to report, maybe some highlights from your study?
Well, I would say that at the end of each chapter, we have a list of the best, or if you want to be the best slacker, you can be your slacker courses, what your curriculum would be as the best slacker with your bachelor's degree. But then we also provide the striver curriculum, what you would take if you can get good advice on what the best courses available in each of those subject areas would be for you. And we try to be that provider of advice, say, these are the kind of courses to look out for. And they are, as you said, the great ideas, great conversation kinds of courses, what Matthew Arnold called the best that has been thought and said in the world. And you can find those courses. So it can be classics of social and political thought. It can be the classics of Western literature. It can be the classics of Eastern literature. You can look at the the monuments of civilization from any civilization, and it's what some of the most interesting and best people in those civilizations have produced.
Yeah.
And that's still present across the whole Ivy League. Now, I remember, I think in one of Madison's chapters, she says, I think it was the writing requirement, just don't take anything this year, hope for better classes next year. Right? That's how bad one of the subject areas was. But Robert George at Princeton teaches a course that's in the core, and you learn like real political science and law.
Yeah.
And everybody at Princeton should want to be in that course.
Do we know how well it's subscribed, either from Robbie or from the university?
I can actually
I don't.
that, yeah, because I did serve as a an aide for Professor George for one of these semesters he taught this, and it is very popular among Princeton students. So he consistently has about 200 or so students in a large lecture hall, and these are not conservative students, but they're students who know that they want a substantive education, and that his course will offer that.
Yeah. So it can be found, but if you don't want to be a slacker, you're going to have to exert some effort. If you get onto one of these campuses, accepted and admitted, you're going to have to look for the good stuff. That's what I'm hearing. Right.
And our concern is that even students who might be interested in that won't be able to find it. That because when you have 750 courses to choose from, and there are a handful that are substantive and would provide a general education, some students are just not going to find those.
Right. So maybe we should back up a bit and just ask, as authors of this work, you've done a real service, I think, to the general public, but who is your intended audience out there? And for the book at large, who would you like to see reading this?
Yeah, we think the book we hope the book will appeal to a broad audience. So prospective students and their families, certainly, but we also think other stakeholders in the education Ivy League students are offering should be interested in this book. So university administrators, members of boards of trustees, and citizens whose taxpayer dollars fund these institutions. So part of what we are trying to convey is that this is important for really any citizen to know. These universities are extremely influential. Their graduates go on to occupy the highest echelons of American life. And so we should all be concerned about what they're learning.
You mentioned specifically the trustees and those who are responsible. Is this the kind of material I've got up on the screen? Our friends over at the American Council of Trustees and Alum, they've been doing some of this work alongside of yours, probably was, I assume, would be helpful in bringing this together. Are you able to disseminate your book to those communities and those trustees? Is there any way that it's going to get into the water table, so to speak, with the leadership?
I hope so. If any university wants to get our book into the hands of all of the trustees, I'd love to see that. I think it would be valuable, especially as, say, universities like University of West Florida, where I'm a trustee, are thinking about taking the step to create an honors college or even an honors school, and think about the principles of higher education that would go into that program or school. Mm-hmm. So knowing what not to do is just as important maybe as what to do. And this is the kind of book that would help senior administrators, trustees, anyone thinking about an honors college for them to have.
Sure. As you've rounded out this book, and I'm sure it was quite a labor, of a passion of yours to get this to print, but I'm wondering, are there things that need to follow? Is there another volume in the works, or would you recommend that continued research be done in this vein? And if so, what's next?
My hope, not to speak for the others, is that we can turn a corner in the discussion of college curriculum again and really have the national conversation, whatever that exactly means, a serious intellectual conversation, but also a citizenship-oriented conversation about what our educated human being and citizen adults in the United States in the 2020s need to have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to add on to what Adam said, I think there are states like Florida who are doing an overhaul at least of the public universities within their state and kind of reforming some of those gen ed requirements. But yeah, I mean, I would love to see a similar study done for like state flagships, larger state universities that are graduating hundreds of thousands of students every year that are going on to, become well, just functioning members of society. So we want them to be well-formed individuals. Yeah.
Fair enough. So parents, prospective students, where would you recommend that they go, right? So that they can make an informed decision, whether they're headed to an Ivy or whether they're going to go to a state school. We want to give them guidance here. And this is certainly, your book is part of that. Where else can they go?
So Choosing College with Confidence is a second-year product now from the Heritage Foundation. And it looks at all 50 states, and Madison has done the most work on this of the three of us. Can say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Choosing College with Confidence, last year when we first launched it, we had around 280 colleges. So we're looking at basically the advice that we got a lot from our state policy network groups that were, really on the ground. They give us advice on kind of which colleges to look at. So we evaluated around 300 colleges. But this year when we launched the new version, we looked at close to 1,000 colleges, I think 994 or something, or close to that amount. And we were looking at some of the larger state flagships, and then also just kind of the larger public universities across the United States. And we looked at, I think, 20 or so different metrics. If you look at our methodology, we have all of the different data metrics that we collected there, but we distinguished basically the universities into three different groups: the green rated colleges, which are highly rated, and then our yellows, which are worth considering, and then our reds, which are not recommended. So I would say we lean more towards having reds than we do green and yellow. But yeah, we just hope that this serves as a resource to parents and families all across the US.
There's a lot more red on them than I'd like to see, Madison. That's a bit discouraging. But again, people need to know, right? Parents need to understand.
I'd also add that one thing that has really struck me in conducting this research is the importance of college visits for prospective students, and not just visiting to see what the campus student life is like, but actually visiting and sitting in on classes, because I think that's ultimately going to be the best way to see what will you learn. And so students and parents should really spend the time on those kinds of visits, I think, to make an educated decision.
I think that makes good sense. Well, let's conclude this, and I'm going to give each of you just a minute or so to give us your best advice, right? We, in Classical Commons, we're serving parents, teachers, and school leaders, and I think they need to know effectively from the K-12 world, where are our children headed next? Where are our students going? So what words of advice would you give the next generation of college students as they attempt to navigate what can often be bewildering, these educational straits, as it were?
So the first question is, should you go to college in the first place? And if you are the kind of person who's cut out for college, you should definitely go. Your economic and life circumstances are going to be better for the kind of moral and intellectual formation you get. But if you're not cut out for it, don't feel bad. Go to the place you're cut out for. But for those who are cut out for it and are ready to go, if you come from a classical background, where a lot of folks who watch this show would come from, see how they will scope and sequence beyond what you've already learned to deepen and broaden out your understanding. Because if you're just going to get a ways of knowing approach with distribution requirements, it's not going to actually do 4 years worth of work for you and your mind.
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of advice that I would give parents and students is to not pay attention to the prestige. I think it's hard to do. It's natural to sort of think of an Ivy degree as having more weight and importance than a degree from another, your state flagship university. But I think if you want the sometimes $80,000 a year of tuition to pay off, you should not be afraid to go to the university you've never heard of, or that a lot of people have never heard of, if you're going to get a better education there, which in a lot of cases I think is true.
Yeah, and I would just lastly add that, 2026 year is a big year for us. It's the 250th anniversary of our great country. So we just encourage families to kind of, that have high school age students, to really sit and think about how can they encourage their students to think intently about the type of education they want to obtain, so that way they can continue the great American traditions that this country has allowed us to have. So.
Thank you, Madison. Thank you, Madison. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Adam. It was so nice to have you with us. And we're going to strongly encourage folks to be reading Slacking and get the down low on where the Ivies are at today, with hopes that something will turn around. We're still hopeful. Thank you both. I thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, join us weekly on the Classical Commons podcast for updates on the renaissance that's budding up in classical liberal arts education. Please subscribe to our podcast and sign up for our bi-monthly newsletter.